neuroscience has explored the brain and its mental functions. This has been in all the press. In particular, this touches also upon originally philosophical questions. How are mind and brain related to each other? Is what the philosophers called the mind nothing but the brain? Just mere gray matter or a gray pulpy mass, as the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer said in the 19th century. Philosophy has picked up the discussion on neuroscience, and many philosophers these days actually feel threatened. Does neuroscience and its investigation of the brain's mental functions replace its philosophy and its focus on mental issues like mind-brain problem, subjectivity, and other much more traditional philosophical questions? So this raises the question of how can we link neuroscience and philosophy? What is called currently neurophilosophy, which takes place mainly in the Anglo-American sphere, is often basically saying that we can replace philosophical discussion by neuroscientific investigation. What is left for philosophy then is to discuss some theoretical issues within neuroscience. This is called neurophilosophy, and I call it reductive neurophilosophy, because here ultimately the aim is to reduce and ultimately even eliminate philosophy in favor of neuroscience. But maybe there is another way to consider the brain in philosophical topics without reducing philosophy to neuroscience. This is what I call non-reductive neurophilosophy, and that is the aim of my talk today. So let us start with what actually neuroscience is. Neuroscience is often considered as an homogeneous discipline. This is far from the truth. The origins of neuroscience are relatively young. Not before the end of the 19th century, people started to investigate the brain. And at that time, neuroscience did not exist as discipline. Rather, the investigation of the brain took place in different disciplines, different departments, like in physiology or in anatomy, or in neurology and psychiatry. There was not yet a discipline of neuroscience at the turn of the 20th century, and for the most part, in the first half of the 20th century, there was no discipline neuroscience. Neuroscience emerged as a discipline in the midst of the 20th century, and since then it has risen rapidly. So look at neuroscience today. Neuroscience is very heterogeneous. So even today it picks up concepts and questions from other disciplines. You all know this. Neurophilosophy is one of those terms. Neurophilosophy aims to explain philosophical concepts by neuroscientific mechanisms of the brain. You know that many other novel terms and disciplines have popped up in the meantime. Neuroeconomy, for instance. Economic concepts like trust are now investigated neuroscientifically. The same with sociological concepts, theological concepts, neurosociology, neuropolitics, neurotheology, just to name you a few. So that already tells you that neuroscience is very heterogeneous. And the kind of terms and concepts neuroscience uses often have a very heterogeneous origins with different connotations and implications. So this is very important to know. Neuroscience is not homogeneous. Neuroscience is a heterogeneous amalgam of concepts from originating in different disciplines. If one wants to say so, neuroscience is like a prostitute. It takes whatever it can and investigates it and uses it for its own purposes. So how now to deal with the concepts from the different disciplines, and how can we link them to neuroscience and its neuroscientific concept? For instance, if you want to investigate the concept of free will, which has an originally philosophical context, with particular neuroscientific mechanism, as for instance, neural activity in the forefront of your brain, the prefrontal cortex. So how now do you link the concept of free will to the concept of the prefrontal cortex? One way, as most of Anglo-American neurophilosophy these days suggests, is to reduce the concept and ultimately replace the concept of free will by the one of prefrontal cortical activity. So that is basically leads to what I show here, the methodological reductionism, that you reduce the theory of free will to the theory of prefrontal cortical activity. Major proponents of that are, for instance, Paul and Patricia Churchland and John Bickel, all located in North America. Another an alternative route to such reductionism is what I call iterativity. So here you take the concept of free will, compare it with the neuroscientific concept of prefrontal cortical activity, and then you do some experiments, and then you compare the data of the experiment again with the concept of free will. So that means you have and then the concept of free will may be somehow altered in its definition by the encounter with the empirical data. So here you can see this is a clearly non-reductionist strategy. I call it iterative because both concept of free will and prefrontal cortical activity, philosophical concept and neuroscientific concept, are continuously compared and changed by this mutual encounter. So this sounds very abstract. At this point, I will lend some support and show how that could function. And this is what I call non-reductive neurophilosophy. So let me go on with my preliminaries. So I considered the relationship between different concepts within philosophy, concepts from different origins within neuroscience. Now, I consider on a larger scale what are current relationships between philosophy and neuroscience, as they are implicitly or explicitly discussed. Let me try, I already indicated that, what you can call methodological reductionism. So ultimately here, the philosophical concepts are reduced or eliminated in favor of neuroscientific data and facts. Free will is nothing but prefrontal cortical activity, and once we understand prefrontal cortical activity, we do not need the concept of free will anymore. This is a very radical position which can be called narrow reductionism. However, there are also more modest and more moderate forms of such reductionism. So for instance, when John Searle assumes that you have to only to adapt the concept of free will to the meaning of the neuroscientific concept like prefrontal cortical activity. So you have to define the philosophical concept in a way that is compatible with the neuroscientific data. So you do not have to eliminate it, but you have to tailor and adapt it in orientation on the neuroscientific concepts. That's, for instance, suggested by John Searle, a major philosopher in US. Then a version of that is the multi-layered model that you have different levels from the empirical concept to the originally philosophical concept. This is, for instance, suggested by Carl Graeber. Then the philosophers may object, no. Neuroscientific concepts are principally different than philosophical concepts. Why? Philosophical concepts are purely logical. They are about sense and meaning. Neuroscientific concepts, in contrast, are about truth and reality. So the concept of prefrontal cortical activity does not carry any meaning or sense in it itself. It's a pure fact as it can be observed and measured. This is different in philosophical concept. The concept of free will, for instance, carries a lot of meaning and a whole semantic context with it. So philosophers like, for instance, Peter Hacker or Colin McGinn and Thomas Nagel argue, no, there's a principal difference between philosophical concepts and neuroscientific concepts and data. The one is about sense and meaning, the other one is about truth and reality. So because of these principal differences, you cannot link the two. So the only way you can do is sort of what I call here methodological parallelism. And that makes any interaction between philosophy and neuroscience impossible. So we basically here are confronted with two extremes. On the one hand, philosophy is reduced to neuroscience and ultimately in favor of neuroscience. On the other hand, philosophy and neuroscience stand side by side without any direct interaction. There's yet another view where they say, okay, they somehow belong together, but they're different fields and they're different levels. This is what Karl Craver says. And he speaks of an explanatory mosaic. At certain levels, we can use the neuroscientific concept. At other levels, we can use the philosophical concept to explain certain phenomena. So there's no need for either reductionism or parallelism. They basically stand side by side like a Chinese who does not speak English and an English who does not speak Chinese. But they somehow are related to each other. So the question is now, for me, maybe there's an even tighter or closer relationship between philosophical concept and neuroscientific concept. Maybe there's an intrinsic relationship. And this is what I try to convey in the following. So one of the problems with, for instance, the explanatory mosaic of Karl Craver is also that it ultimately it's just based on observation as methodological standard. But, as pointed out, for instance, by Bennett and Hacker, philosophical concepts do not follow the observational standard. They are not based on observation. The criteria for judging a philosophical concept are not based on observation, as in neuroscience. Instead, it is based on purely logical criteria. So whether it's logically consistent is much more important for philosophical concept than whether you can observe it or not. That does not matter for philosophical concept. For neuroscientific concept, if you do not observe prefrontal cortical activity, the prefrontal cortical activity makes no sense. For the philosopher, that doesn't matter. For him, it's just important that the notion of, for instance, free will is logically consistent. So what we are confronted here is how can we link the different methodological standards? The methodological standard of observation from neuroscience and the logical standard of philosophy. That ultimately touches upon the much more deeper question, how are the natural world of the scientist related to the purely logical world of the philosophers? And for that, I say, we need a particular strategy, methodological strategy, to link both worlds and their respective standards. The logical world and its logical standard with the natural world and its observational standard. And for that, I suggest we have to follow the strategy what I call concept-fact iterativity. This is a question which reaches deeper than purely reducing philosophy to neuroscience. It touches upon the question whether we can use the brain and the concept of brain in a fruitful way for philosophical discussions. So, and this is what I mean by non-reductive neurophilosophy. What exactly do I mean? So first, let me define it in a negative sense. Non-reductive philosophy, as already made clear, does not pursue any kind of methodological reductionism. And this is important. It neither favors a reductionism of philosophical concepts to neuroscientific concepts, nor does it favor any kind of reduction of the logical argumentative method of philosophy to the observational experimental method in neuroscience. These are simply two different methods. You cannot confuse them. Yeah? And that means you also cannot reduce them to each other. But the fact that you cannot reduce them to each other does not imply that you cannot link them with each other. And that's exactly what I'm intending to do. So what does this imply, for instance, with regard to the mind-brain problem? So the mind is a philosophical concept and implies a logical standard. The brain is a neuroscientific concept and only requires the observational standard. And often these two standards is often considered, this is a mind-brain dualism. And then you say there's an existence of a mind and an existence of a brain. But maybe this dualism is more of sort of a methodological origin which reflects a methodological difference between an observational standard and a logical standard. So how can we link those two? Okay, let me sketch the difference between reductive and non-reductive neurophilosophy. And for that, I introduce the concept of domain. Put very simple, domains are particular constellations of topics. For instance, the ethical domain. The ethical domain is about ethical questions. How shall we behave? What ought to be the case? Moral judgment, moral values. These are all typical ethical questions. So I say there's an ethical domain. Then another domain in philosophy is the domain of epistemology, of knowledge. What can we know? And some philosophers, like the earlier German philosopher Immanuel Kant, even raised the question, what can we not know? Maybe the way we know the world may not be the world itself, as it is independent of our knowledge itself. Then one of the main domains in philosophy is the metaphysical domain. Metaphysics is about the existence and reality of things. And then there's yet another domain I sketched here, the phenomenal domain, which is about consciousness, like intentionality and other features of our consciousness, and how do we subjectively experience the world and ourselves in our consciousness. And ultimately what reductive neurophilosophy says, all these different domains can be reduced to the empirical domain, as sketched in the lower part. The empirical domain is the domain of observation. What we can observe in the world, like the brain and its various forms of neuronal activity. So that also means that the only standard, the methodological standard applied in reductive neurophilosophy, comes down to observation. It's the observational experimental method of science in general and neuroscience in particular. So you see that ultimately all the concepts from these different domains, phenomenal, ethical, epistemological, metaphysical, are reduced to the ones in the empirical domain, and the only methodological standard holding observation. So ultimately these different domains are reduced to the empirical domains. how does a non-reductive neurophilosophy looks like in contrast? Here you can see that it is not so much reduction. You can see that the arrows do not point from the phenomenal, ethical, epistemological, and metaphysical domain to the empirical domain as in reductive philosophy. Instead, it is rather, the focus is on the linkages between the empirical domain on the one hand and the other domains, the phenomenal, ethical, epistemological, metaphysical on the other. So basically, it is not a unilateral border traffic, but it's bilateral. And nothing in the one border is not swallowed up by the other, but it's really a bilateral traffic from the empirical domain to the phenomenal domain and vice versa. So the focus is here not on reducing the domains to the empirical domain, but is rather on trying to find the linkages, the border territory between the different domains. And below you can see for that, different methods are used and combined. It is not only the observational method that is used, but a spectrum of different methods, like rational arguments, the classical philosophical method, conceptual analysis, as particular in analytic philosophy of mind, phenomenal analysis, analysis of consciousness, as it has been developed in phenomenology by Edmund Husserl in the beginning of the 20th century in continental Europe. And then obviously observation and experiments as in science. So you see we have a plurality of methods and we have a plurality of different domains, and the overlap between these different domains and the linkages are the focus of a non-reductive neurophilosophy. I put forward the following thesis. There is an intrinsic linkage of neuroscience with philosophy. The facts in neuroscience are bilaterally and iteratively dependent on the concepts in philosophy. So that means from the data and facts we observe in neuroscience, we can go to philosophical concepts. Concepts enter unavoidably neuroscience, since there's no concept-free neuroscience. Concepts are relevant for neuroscience in testing for the conceptual plausibility of neuroscientific things. For instance, when you write a neuroscientific paper, you have different parts. You have an introduction, you have a method, you have a result, and the discussion section. And what you do in the discussion is usually you compare the neuroscientific concept, which you usually traditionally introduced in the introduction, to the data and findings you described in method and result. So this is basically what, and you cannot, and any kind of observation of data and facts will always be described in terms of concept. For instance, even prefrontal cortical activity is a concept which ultimately carries a certain meaning. It is supposed to describe certain observations, but these observations we can only express in terms of a concept. Now, what neuroscience did recently, it extended towards concepts from philosophy. For instance, concepts like self-consciousness were originally developed in the context of philosophy, and its logical world and its logical standard. So that, of course, contrasts with the observational standard and the natural world as presupposed in neuroscience. So we thus need to make a transition from an originally purely logical concept of self, for instance, of consciousness, into the observational and natural world of neuroscience. So, and this is a very important point. Philosophy is usually about the logical world and logical standards. And what the philosopher is interested in is logical consistency, because he ultimately presupposes the logical world. The logical world is that world which is any kind of possible world that can be logically consistent. The actual world we live in the natural world, may be one of these possible worlds. But it may extend. For instance, the philosopher can well imagine a world where there is no gravity. If that is logically possible, even naturally, it's impossible in our natural world, but logically, you can well imagine a world without gravity. Maybe even a world without brains, but where there are nevertheless some mental features. I leave this for you to think about. So this is what the philosopher is about. The neuroscientist, in contrast, just focuses on the natural world. The world where there's gravity and the world where there are brains. This is the world we live in. This is the universe we live in. This is what is the natural world and its natural conditions. So now, and it's indicated the logical world is the world of philosophy, the natural world is the world of neuroscience. And the neurophilosopher is now exactly interested in the boundary. So where is the boundary of the natural world when compared to the logical world? And where does the logical world comes to its end and transforms into a natural world? This is very important because concepts like self and consciousness were originally developed and characterized within the logical world. So they are logical, purely logically characterized. And now, if they are investigated in the context of the brain, they are shifted into the natural world. So we have to see maybe there are certain features we assign to those concepts which belong to the natural world, but which belong to the logical world, but not to the natural world. We may not know which features are these. So the only way to do this is to combine the philosophical and the neuroscientific investigation. And this is what non-reductive neurophilosophy is about. Let me come to the second thesis. As an intrinsic linkage of philosophy with science and neuroscience, bilateral and iterative dependence of the concepts in philosophy on the facts in neuroscience. So now I reverse things. Before I said that the facts and data in neuroscience are dependent upon the concepts in philosophy, now I take the reverse stance. From concepts to facts. Facts enter unavoidably philosophy. Since there is no relevant fact-free philosophy of the natural world. Facts may not be relevant for philosophy within the logical world. Yes. But within the natural world, and the way we can approach the natural world based on our capacities, we apparently cannot avoid having some kind of data and facts. So if philosophy wants to be relevant for the natural world, it has to consider some facts in its concept. Meaning a fact-free philosophy of the natural world, which is relevant for the natural world, remains impossible. So what we need to do is to test for the empirical plausibility of our philosophical concepts if we want to apply them to the natural world. If, in contrast, facts are neglected, one would presuppose a purely logical world, as for instance in logical positivism or logical behaviorism. That though must fail because logical conditions, for instance sense, only overlap in part but are not identical with natural conditions and truth. So I know this all sounds very complex, and I will illustrate that in the following slides by one example. Let me start with some historical reference. What I basically say is we need to link philosophical concepts and neuroscientific data and facts. So ultimately, the linkage between philosophy and neuroscience boils down to the linkage between concepts and facts. This has already been pointed out by two very prominent philosophers in the past. One of them, Immanuel Kant. Many of you probably know this very famous quote in the Critique of Pure Reason of Immanuel Kant: "Thoughts without contents are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind." So if you want to translate it into my context. Philosophy without science or neuroscience is empty. Science without philosophy is blind. Meaning, philosophy without science would be a philosophy without facts, and hence it would be empty and not relevant for the natural world. Science without concepts, neuroscience or data without concepts would be blind, because then it remains unclear what exactly these data and facts really refer to and describe. So both are somehow must be linked with each other in order to understand the brain and the world and how it links mental features. Alfred North Whitehead, another philosopher, at the beginning of the 20th century, wrote a major work, Process and Reality. And he considers science and philosophy as basically different levels of abstraction. And he brings a wonderful metaphor with an aeroplane. Let me read it. The true method of discovery is like the flight of an aeroplane. It starts from the ground of particular observation, as in science. It makes a flight in the thin air of imaginative generalization, as in philosophy. And it again lands for renewed observation, as in science, rendered acute by rational interpretation. So here you can already see that the method of science, renewed observation, and the method of philosophy, rational interpretation, are directly compared. The aeroplane starts with observation on the airport. Then it goes up into the air, it gets philosophy and does rational interpretation. And then it comes down again with a renewed insight from philosophy onto the ground and the airport. And basically what you can see here is an iterative relationship between the airport, the airplane being in the airport, and the airplane flying up in the thin air. And it goes back and forth, and each time the airplane lands on the airport, it is somehow different and somehow changed because it has been up in the thin air. The same now with philosophy and neuroscience, with a continuously iterative relationship back and forth between them. And this is what I want to illustrate in the following. So this is what I mean by there's a methodological iterativity between concepts and facts. You already know this slide. The heterogeneity of neuroscience, concepts from different disciplines. You try, for instance, we tried initially to translate the concept of free will, which is a philosophical concept, into the concept of prefrontal cortical activity. And then what neuroscience does is this one. I shortened this here because there are many different steps often investigated in philosophy of science. You develop a neuroscientific hypothesis. You define your experimental variables, dependent and independent variables. Then you do an experiment, you obtain certain experimental data, you interpret them, you call this neuroscientific facts, and then you compare that with your original neuroscientific hypothesis. So this is the lower part, is what happens in neuroscience. This is nothing special. But what neurophilosophy is about, that now you use the neuroscientific facts and you compare them again with your original philosophical concept. So let's say, for instance, doing any kind of free will decision, you find a change in your prefrontal cortical activity. And then you see how those data and facts are compatible with the original definition of free will. So what I want to do in the following now is to illustrate this schema by an example, so that you get a little bit more grip on what is meant by methodological iterativity. Okay, let me take the example of self. You wake up every morning, and at least I hope so, and then you go probably into the bathroom, you see yourself in the mirror, Sometimes you might get a shock, but usually you probably say, ah, this is me. Unless you were completely drunk in the night before. So the concept of self has a long history in philosophy. One of the main philosophers, you may know him, is René Descartes in the 15th and 16th century. He said, I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. Very famous sentence in philosophy. Basically, he said that as long as I think, as long as I have TPJ. So suddenly, the self-specificity of these midline regions is put into doubt on empirical grounds. So maybe, and let me provide you some support for that. So this is basically here, maybe we cannot really see the concept of self as an entity. Because the entity, basically translated into the realm of the empirical realm of the brain, presupposes self-specific regions. But apparently the midline regions are not specific to self and personally relevant stimuli. Then you could argue maybe there are some other regions in the brain which process personally relevant stimuli in a specific way. So far, there's no empirical evidence in favor of that. Rather, it seems that any region in the brain can do a lot of different functions. That puts in doubt the characterization of the concept of self as entity. Whether it's mental entity or neural entity, it doesn't matter. It is the entity-based nature which may be put into doubt by the empirical data. Okay, let me go to the second characterization, the all or nothing characterization. So Descartes said either the self is present or it's absent. There's nothing in between. How about the empirical data? Either the cortical midline regions are active or inactive. There's no continuum, there's nothing in between. So this is the studies of ours, published 2009, where we showed that what you call in the empirical context a parametric modulation. We distinguish between different degrees of personal relevance. For instance, when you live in Ottawa, the picture of Ottawa winter is highly relevant to you because it's freezingly cold. If you, let's say, you come here only as a visitor, let's say for 2 weeks, but go back to beautiful Italy, like in Rome, then, yeah, okay, the picture from Ottawa is somehow relevant, but not so high relevant for you. Let's say you are from Rome and you see a picture of Taiwan with tropical climate and you have never been to Taiwan and you have absolutely no intention to go to Taiwan and you have never heard about this, it has no relevance at all. So here you have what we call high relevance, medium relevance, low self-relevance. And this is exactly what we tested here in the studies on letting subjects viewing pictures and evaluate them according to high, medium, low self-relevance. And you could see nicely that you have different gradations of neuronal activity. It is not an all or nothing. But you have, according to the degree of self-relatedness or self-relevance, you have different degrees of neuronal activity. This is high self-relevance, high neuronal activity. Medium self-relevance, medium level of neuronal activity. Low self-relevance, no activity. And these are actually some subcortical regions for the expert among you, like the amygdala or the ventral striatum or the cortex and the tectum. So that argues, these data argue against an all or nothing a definition of self and non-self. Rather, there seems to be a continuum between different degrees of self and self-relatedness. So, let me summarize the previous slides. Neural activity in midline structures may not be specific for self-specific stimuli. They're also recruited during familiar stimuli, is for instance when you here in Canada see Stephen Harper, or when you're from the US you see Obama, or when you're from another country you see the respective prime minister. And there is apparently no self-specific regions or network in the brain. Then is the self really categorically distinguished from the non-self in neuronal activity in an all or nothing way? Apparently not. This is not really empirically plausible, as I showed you in the previous data. So when you put everything now together, there seems to be a certain mismatch between the empirical data and the philosophical concept of self. So the brain, is the self really an entity? A neural entity within the brain? Yes, sure, the brain is involved, but there are no self-specific regions. So, and also conceptually speaking, the self may not be really within the brain. Then there are no self-specific regions, and there's no clear all or nothing or self, non-self distinction. Rather, it seems to be a matter of degree, a continuum. So this is what I demonstrated you so far. Most interestingly, these midline regions, and I will come back to that in subsequent slides, are also active in patients in vegetative state. What is vegetative state? You lose your consciousness, but you're still alive. For instance, a very prominent patient in vegetative state is the Formula One driver, Michael Schumacher, who had a ski accident around Christmas and is since in vegetative state. And so these patients, by definition, do not have consciousness anymore. But they nevertheless show some activity in the midline regions. I will come back to that. So that would argue against the linkage of the concept of self with the one of consciousness. So you can see that what we did here is I went through this loop in an iterative way. I started with the philosophical concept of self by Descartes, with the three features. Then I translated it into the current neuroscientific concept of self-relatedness. And that was amenable to experimental testing. That showed the midline regions and all of that. And then we compared the data and the facts which we got with the original philosophical concepts. Do the data really suggest that the concept of self is an entity, a neural entity? No, there are no specific regions in the brain. Do the data suggest that the self can be defined in an all or nothing way? No, because there's a parametric modulation, a continuous degree of different grades of self associated with different degrees of neuronal activity. Can the self really associated with consciousness as suggested by Descartes and many philosophers since? No, because the cortical midline structures are also active in patients who have no consciousness, like vegetative state, which on a tentative basis argues against the consciousness-based definition of self. I will come back to that. So what you all over have when you consider everything together, you have a mismatch between the philosophical concept of self and the data and facts related to the neuroscientific investigation of self. So basically, if you want to boil it down, you have a mismatch between facts and concept. So how can we deal with that? We can change the data. No, you can't, because the data, you cannot change the data. This is what the data tell us. Yes, maybe we have to have better technologies and instruments, and they will reveal that the self is a neural entity. Yes, maybe so, but the evidence so far speaks against that. Then the other option would be to change your concept of self, to make it empirically more plausible. For instance, rather than defining the self as entity, you might define the self as a process or a form or mode of organization. You then, different features, you reject the entity-based definition of self. The self is neither a neural entity or a mental entity. It's rather a specific form or process. And then you might have the self not as a separate entity, but the self is as your experience. It's everywhere and nowhere. Yourself is in your emotions, in your values, in your movement, in your actions, in your perception. So it may be, rather than an entity, it may be somehow pervade as a neural organization or form any kind of processing. And that also means that the self may not be such a higher order function. It may rather be a more basic function. And last not least, it may be a particular organization or neural organization in the brain. I don't want to go into detail of this, but what you see is that you can define the self in a way that is different from an entity-based concept of self. So this is a process-based concept of self or organization-based concept of self, as distinguished from an entity-based concept of self, as Descartes suggested. So you can change your concepts, your philosophical concepts. Okay. Let me now change another concept. Now you may be puzzled. Changing the concept of the brain. So usually we presuppose the concept of brain as a purely reflex apparatus. This is what you call extrinsic view of the brain. The brain, you see a particular stimulus, for instance here, the textbook stimulus, the cover of the textbook, and that receives your brain, and your brain induces certain neuronal activity. This is what you usually call stimulus-induced or task-evoked activity. And most importantly, neuroscientists usually associated that activity completely and exclusively with the stimulus. So the brain is like your car. You hit the gas pedal, and then the car drives. Without hitting the gas pedal, the car doesn't drive, is completely inactive. What you call, basically the brain itself has no say in what happens in the brain. The data, however, show something different. The data show, the most recent data, that particularly in the midline regions, you have a strong resting state activity. Rest means here the absence of any particular task or stimuli. So you have continuously ongoing and changing activity in your brain. This is called resting state activity. And with that activity, you approach the stimuli. And then the resulting activity is really a mixture of your resting state and your stimulus. It is a particular interaction. The exact mechanism of this interaction remaining unclear so far. So, and this is, can you call, an intrinsic view of the brain, because there's an activity, neuronal activity, which is intrinsic to the brain. And the brain itself has a strong say in what happens in the brain, as for instance induced by the stimuli. So, why do I mention that? Because it's very important for our understanding of the self. There has been investigations by our group and others where you show a strong overlap between self and resting state. Self-related stimuli and resting state. And as very paradoxically, certain self-related stimuli, like your own name, do not change the activity, in particular the midline regions. So there seems to be an overlap between self and resting state. This is illustrated in this picture where we put together, we showed the overlap between all studies during self-related stimuli and the default mode network, which is a typical resting state network, very strong in the particular the midline regions. And you can see the red signifies the overlap between self and resting state. So that means maybe that our self and its overlap with rest imply that when we experience a sense of self, for instance, when you look at the mirror in the morning, that there's a certain interaction between the stimulus and your ongoing resting state. So this is new novel territory, which we coined rest-stimulus interaction. Okay, so now let me come back to my final slides. How does all that relate to the iterative methodology I suggest here. Let me give you an example. I sketched so far that the brain has an intrinsic activity which impacts and somehow shapes the processing of the stimulus in yet unclear ways. That reminds you very much of, for instance, the concept of mind Immanuel Kant suggested. He also suggested that the mind provides an input. The mind has an internal structure and organization, which, by means of which it structures and organizes the processing of any kind of stimuli from outside the mind. Translates this to the brain, what Kant called the structuring and organizing input the mind provides to the stimuli may consist in the brain and its intrinsic activity. Like the mind, the brain may provide an input, the brain itself might provide an input to the processing of the stimuli, which are usually considered as the sole and only input. So this led me to write this paper about Immanuel Kant's mind and the brain's resting state. So the nature and feature and task and role of this intrinsic activity in the brain remains more or less unclear. It is subject to intense research these days because we simply do not know yet the exact feature of the brain's intrinsic activity and why and how it organizes stimulus-induced activity in such a way that, for instance, we can have consciousness. So, because this is the central point, Kant assumed that the input of the mind, its structure and organizing of stimuli, is necessary in order to have consciousness and also a sense of self. Without such input by the mind, we would not have consciousness. Same, I now claim that without the brain's input and its intrinsic activity and its yet unknown features, we would not have consciousness. How can I support this view? I wrote it here in a book, which appeared in German, The Undisciplined Brain, What's Now Mr. Kant? But how can we support this thesis of the relevance of the brain's intrinsic activity for consciousness? Let me give you a brief example of studies in vegetative state patients. As said, these patients are by definition non-conscious. And they interestingly show indeed changes in the resting state activity. In particular, what you can see here in the functional connectivity and in particular the variability. This is called here the ALF, amplitude of low frequency fluctuation. FC is functional connectivity. And you can see we tested particular for the midline regions. And most interestingly, that these patients show decreased variability and functional connectivity in the midline region. So meaning their resting state activity is no longer as well connected and it is no longer as variable. It is somehow, if you want to say so, frozen. Yeah? It doesn't change anymore, meaning there is not much communication. When you're in a room, everybody is sort of sunk into his own thought. There's not much communication, there's not much change anymore. There's not much exchange between the different people, and the positions of the different people do not change either. There's not much functional connectivity and there's not much variability of neuronal activity in these patients. So that strongly suggests that these patients do indeed show decreased resting state activity. And even more important, that resting state activity predicted the degree of task-evoked activity, as you can see here. Meaning the higher the variability in your resting state, the more stimulus-induced activity you have. And the more stimulus-induced activity you have, the higher your degree of consciousness. So that provides some first evidence that particularly the variability of the resting state is central for assigning consciousness to task-evoked or stimulus-induced activity. This is what you can see here. The higher your stimulus-induced activity, the higher your degree of consciousness. And this is holds for anterior midline regions here in the front, the PACC, perigenital anterior cingulate, and for posterior midline region, like the posterior cingulate cortex. So what does this really mean with regard to the relationship between self and consciousness? Philosophy usually considers the self in reference to consciousness. This is well reflected in the concept of reflective self, like Descartes or current cognitive approaches to the self, or as in phenomenological philosophy, the concept of a pre-reflective self, a sense of self, an experience of self prior to any cognitive reflection, which goes back to Edmund Husserl and is often suggested by current phenomenological philosophers like Dan Zahavi. Neuroscience, in contrast, shows that there's still some activity related to self-related stimuli. If you present, for instance, autobiographical events to these VS patients, they can still differentiate them from non-self-related events. So this means, despite these patients being non-conscious, they still show some activity related to self-relevant stimuli. So what does this mean? Does this put into doubt the linkage between self and consciousness, as usually presupposed in philosophy? I leave this open, but you see that the empirical data raise a lot of interesting questions. So I leave this out, and you can see again that maybe the traditional linkage between self and consciousness may need to be put in doubt by the data and facts obtained in neuroscience, in particular these vegetative patients. And that you have, again, another instance of a mismatch between fact and concepts. So you can constantly have to go back and forth between the philosophical concepts to neuroscientific data, go back to the philosophical concepts, and then you can start again. You can start a new investigation. So it's really an iterative movement by means of which both the philosophical concepts are changed and redefined, and also by means of which you then might get some new ideas for new experiments. So if you define your concept of self, for instance, independent of consciousness, then you might look for an experimental design where you have yourself independent of consciousness. So it also leads to new experimental design, and it leads back and forth and iterative. So this is really you can see the methodological reductionism of reductive neurophilosophy is here replaced by an iterativity, concept-fact iterativity, and amounting to what can be called non-reductive neurophilosophy. So now, the traditional philosophers among you might object. What ultimately I'm doing here amounts to metaphysical reductionism. Do I reduce consciousness to the brain's intrinsic activity? And do I reduce ultimately the mind, signified by consciousness, to the brain, signified by its intrinsic activity? This would methodologically then ultimately amount to reductive rather than non-reductive neurophilosophy. So this is very important. So the brain's intrinsic activity cannot be considered in an isolated way. Empirically, this is sufficient. This is all the neuroscientists need to do, investigate the intrinsic activity. But it may be very important also to relate it to the way, because though originating within the brain itself, it does not mean that it is not related to the world outside the brain. So that means, and more experiments show that the brain's intrinsic activity may occur in an ecological context, that is, within the way, within the world. So, and that the intrinsic activity may be not purely neuronal, but rather neuroecological. So it cannot be reduced just to a pure neuronal origin, but the origin, of course, it is generated within the brain, but it does not mean that it is not generated in relation to the world. A world-brain interface, as I will say in the following. So basically that means that the intrinsic activity you cannot reduce just to the brain itself. Rather, then of course the traditional metaphysician may say, yes, this is the point where the mind comes into play. And I say, no, this is a logical assumption. This may be valid for the logical world. You remember the distinction between logical and natural world. Within the natural world, you might need to consider the world and how the world interfaces with the brain and vice versa, which you might call the world-brain problem, which then replaces the mind-brain problem. Let me sketch this in the following. Let me skip these slides. This is the slide here. You might have here what you call the natural world. Then you have the world-brain interface and also the, let's say, specified, for instance, also the body-brain interface. So how is the intrinsic activity generated? The intrinsic activity may be generated in relation to the direct context. This is a particular encoding strategy. And that in turn, and this is where you can say on a conceptual level, you might want to speak of a neuroecological concept of brain. Then you have the level of the brain's intrinsic activity, as I called the resting state activity. This is relying on Kant. You might want to speak of a neurotranscendental concept of brain. And then you have all the cognitive functions, sensory functions, affective functions, cognitive functions of the brain's extrinsic activity. It's when you want to speak of a brain-world interface. So this is what, again, relying on Kant, you might want to call a neuroempirical concept of brain. And then, it's unfortunately cut off, you experience a body, you experience a lived body, you experience the world in terms of consciousness and phenomenal terms. Then you have intentionality and consciousness, and you have a lived world. And with that, then you approach the natural world. So what you can see here, this is no longer a mind-brain reductionism. Instead, the mind-brain problem is replaced by what you want to call the world-brain problem. And mind-brain reductionism is here replaced by world-brain relationism, or the world-brain relation. And this again can be empirically investigated. So when you consider it this way, you again see that even the mind-brain problem, you might start here, go through neuroscience, and rephrase the mind-brain problem within the natural world as a world-brain problem. Whereas in the logical world, you might still speak of a mind-brain problem, but it's clear that that is valid only for the logical world as distinguished from the natural world. Whereas within the natural world, you might rather want to speak of a world-brain problem, which is much more empirically plausible than a mind-brain problem within the natural world. So you can see that the encounter, the iterative encounter between philosophy and neuroscience leads to reformulation of traditional philosophical problems rather than to reduction of these problems to neuroscientific data and facts. And this is ultimately what you need to do. You need to consider that you have a continuous iterative loop, and you always have to consider that your different methodologies, that you do not infer your metaphysics from your respective methodology. Based on observation, you would reduce the mind to the brain. But if you use another methodological strategy, you might still maintain it. So all what you can say that you need to consider the brain, and paradoxically, you might want to say that you need to mind the brain, and that leads to my textbook, Minding the Brain, which will come out this year in May. Thank you very much.